Stanford sits on the ancestral lands of the Muwekma Ohlone tribe.
This land was and continues to be of great importance to the Ohlone people.
Consistent with our values of community and inclusion,
We have a responsibility to acknowledge, honor, and make visible
the university's relationship to Native peoples.
Hello, I'm Veronica Roberts, the John and Jill Friedenrich Director of the Cantor Arts Center at Stanford. I am thrilled to welcome you to today's Artists on the Future conversation featuring Cecilia Alemani and Darren Walker. This series seeks to bring together significant artists and cultural thought leaders together in conversation about issues critical to our future. The series starts with a simple and provocative premise that the arts are essential and consequential. Artists and the arts present different vantage points and lenses for understanding the world around us. Through the arts, we gain insights into the changing human experience in all its dimensions. Artists have also always been on the front lines of social justice. They help us imagine alternative futures and new modes of being and doing. Artists are truth tellers, alchemists, healers, activists, and visionaries. Tonight, we are so fortunate to have Darren Walker, president of the Ford Foundation, speaking with Cecilia Alemani about the most consequential international art exhibition on the planet, the Venice Biennale. For those who have never been, the Venice Biennale is the Olympics of the art world. There's so much to celebrate and discuss tonight about Cecilia's truly remarkable and inspired curatorial work for the Biennale, but I did just want to briefly shine a spotlight on one of the artists highlighted in that show, who epitomizes not only the Biennale presentation, but also the spirit of this series, the late, great Ruth Asawa. Ruth Asawa's work is a pillar of the Cantor's collection and a testament to how artists and the arts change the way we look at the world. She was a prolific, pioneering artist and mother of 6 children. She was also the child of immigrants, a survivor of Japanese American incarceration during World War II, a tireless advocate for arts education, and a fervent believer that art should be not only in museums and schools, but also in public spaces. Today, we are looking forward to a lively and enlightening conversation with Darren and Cecilia, but first I would like to thank both the Cantor and Stanford art staff for their work behind the scenes to make this event happen, especially Tammy Fortin, Ann Shulock, Connie Coe, Robert de Armand, and Gordon Gurley. And of course, the series would not be possible without the generosity of Komal Shah and Gaurav Garg. I'd like to invite Komal, avid art collector, former tech executive, board member at SF MoMA, Stanford alumna, and longtime supporter of the arts at Stanford, to introduce our speakers. Thank you.
Thank you, Veronica. Welcome to our 4th year of Artists on the Future. I am so pleased to welcome Veronica Roberts, director of the Cantor Arts Center, as the new host of Artists on the Future. Veronica replaces our beloved Matthew Tews, who retired last summer. I'm excited to partner with Veronica on this critically important series, as she's not only super thoughtful and knowledgeable, but she's also kind and compassionate. Now, as you might remember, our past conversations highlighted accomplished and activist artists in dialogue with stalwarts from socio-political fields to help us see through their lens on the future, which totally makes sense given the title, Artists on the Future. So you might be wondering why today's conversation does not include any artists, right? Here's why. Last year, we witnessed a watershed moment in the arts at the most important art event in the world, the 59th Venice Biennale, one that has already caused a seismic shift at how we exhibit art and we think about art and artists. The 2022 Biennale set new benchmarks for embracing diversity. 90% of the artists shown were women and gender non-conforming, as opposed to a third on an average in prior biennales. Now, to top it all, it set an all-time attendance record, even with travel restrictions, harboring 35% more attendance than its predecessors. Over 800,000 visitors visited the Biennale. Now, here, I think, is resounding proof that excellence and equity are not mutually exclusive. Today, we bring to you a power woman with quiet strength, the artistic director for the 2022 Biennale, Cecilia Alemani. Cecilia is currently the director of the Highline Art in New York City and has served as the artistic director of the inaugural Art Basel Cities, Buenos Aires in 2018, and curator of the Italian Pavilion in 2017 Venice Biennale. She was ranked second on Art Review's Power 100 in 2022, which is their annual ranking of the most influential people in the arts. Now, conversing with Cecilia is a longtime friend of the series and a champion of equity and social justice, and president of the Ford Foundation, Darren Walker. Darren is easily the most inspirational leader of our times, or as Sir Elton John called him, the equalizer in his Times 100 tribute. Welcome back, Darren. We are so grateful to see you again. I now turn it over to Darren and Cecilia to take it from here.
Thank you so much, Komal. It's great to see you and all the great work you do and Veronica's outstanding leadership. And now to Cecilia Alemani.
Hi, Darren. Nice to see you.
Hi, Cecilia. You are absolutely, as Veronica and Komal said, the most prominent, the most influential curator of your generation. And you were appointed the chief curator and head of the 59th Biennale. The 2022 Biennale was unprecedented. Before we get to the radical ideas that you brought forth, just share with us, what did that feel like when you learned that you had been chosen to head the 59th Biennale in Venice?
Well, it was a few seconds of excitement and happiness. You know, it's the appointment of the director of the Venice Biennale is very much up to the president of the Biennale, and you basically just receive a call out of the blue. And I remember receiving that call one day at the end of 2019, and I imagined what it was about as soon as I picked up. And of course, you're extremely honored and happy. And then, you know, just 5 minutes after, you realize what it's going to mean for your life, both professional and personal, because of course it's a giant process, a project, and a monumental effort. But of course, you know, it is, as it was said, one of the most important exhibitions a curator could dream of curating. And also, as being Italian, it has even more meaning for me as the first Italian woman to curate this exhibition in 127 years. So it was a mix of happiness, of happiness and fear, I would say.
Well, you may have been concerned and afraid, but you were fearless in the courage and bravery you showed. Now, Cecilia, there were over 200 artists, 58 countries, coming off of a pandemic. There were so many challenges, from logistics to how to have a post-pandemic Biennale. What prepared you? What in your history? I certainly know from knowing you from the Highline that you are nothing if not inventive and innovative. But what prepared you for this moment?
Well, I think it was a long journey and a long preparation. In a sense, as a curator, perhaps I have less of a traditional background. I don't work for regular museums. I don't have a ceiling or walls where to exhibit art. My main job is the High Line. So in a way, it's a profession, and it's a platform that requires inventiveness and creativity within the whole process, because it's a very untraditional institution. And then I did have relationship with Venice, with the Biennale, when in 2017 I curated the National Pavilion. So the Biennale is divided in the main exhibition, which I had the honor of curating last year, and then there are about 80 national pavilions, among which, of course, there is Italy, which is the hosting country. So I did curate that show in 2017, which was the first confrontation with Italian greatness and bureaucracy, and what it means to do a show on an island. So I think I had a few hints and suggestions, but overall, I don't think there is not anything that prepares you for that. It's just an enormous degree of work and concentration, and then the hope that art will shine on its own. So focusing really much on the artist's voice.
Well, Cecilia, at a time when certainly the world is more global than ever, what do you think the role of global exhibitions, and particularly the Venice Biennale, this really one-of-a-kind exhibition, what is the unique role it plays in the sort of ecosystem, the landscape of arts and culture?
Well, I think, people love to criticize biennials and triennials because, of course, since the 1990s, there has been a giant proliferations and explosions. I think they are incredible instruments for, on one side, art professionals to get to know art scenes and art worlds that are not necessarily what we see in New York City. And on the other side, I think there are incredible platforms for the artists themselves to kind of challenge their practice and to confront themselves with peers and with an institution that might not be what they're used to in this country and other countries. So I think, the role and the importance of this exhibition is extremely, it's vital within the ecosystem of the art world, and in particular the Venice Biennale, which is the oldest biennale in the world. It was founded in 1895. 1895 was the first edition. It's been even more important, I think, because in a way, it still relies on these sort of obsolete models of the National Pavilion, which is something that is a sort of heritage of, the large sort of expo or international expositions of the 19th century. While it might look still quite obsolete to have these kind of national pavilions that highlight ideas of nationality and nations that might be completely old, it is also a way, though, to bring to the fore countries and voices that might not actually end up being in the main exhibition. And so the idea that you have pavilions from all over the world trying to give you a sort of course, uncompleted map of the geography of the art world is still, I think, quite exciting and quite unique, because in the end, the Venice Biennale is the only institution that has that structure. So people usually love to hate the national pavilions, but I do think it's actually quite brilliant. And in a way, it's more about how the artists use these pavilions in a smart and sometimes also critical way.
Yeah, let's expand on that, because I think the role of these exhibitions, and particularly Venice, on the artist. So let's talk about the artist, because that's why you do this, your passion to support the artists. I certainly think of Sonia Boyce and her representation of the UK. Sonia was an artist well known in some corners, but completely unknown, even in the UK in many corners, and certainly globally not known. Obviously, representing the UK had a major impact on her, I think, on her visibility.
Sure.
But talk about this more broadly, this question of the impact on the artist and the artist's career as a result of Venice.
Yeah, I think, of course, it's participating in one of these exhibitions, and in Venice in particular, is probably the one line that you will always use when you're introducing yourself. No, I represented, the USA in the 2022 Biennial, or I was part of the show, and it's of course a great kind of trademark that goes, maybe it's also understandable to those that are not necessarily part of the art world, because the Venice Biennale in Italy, but I also would say, I would argue for sure in Europe, is an institution that goes well beyond the art world, in particular Venice, because it has many different sectors, including the Architecture Biennale and the Film Festival. So it really reaches an audience that is broader than just the art world. And I think for an artist to participate is, of course, one of their key moments in their career, because they do confront themselves with this very, very extended audience. And in a way, when I say audience, I mean both the people that go and pay the tickets to go see the show, but also the incredible world that is their peers and colleagues and all these incredible artists that show next to them. And so another great aspect of participating in these shows is the relationships that get formed as you install the show, as you present your work, and it can be with the artist next to you, but it can also be people that you meet in the exhibition space. So there are, not only questions of visibility, of bringing your work to the fore, but also hopefully you'll be able to also create incredible relationships with peers and colleagues and friends that will last forever.
Well, when I first heard the title, I, like probably many others, said, what is Cecilia talking about? The milk of dreams. What is this, the milk of dreams? This idea that is rooted in surrealism, and I believe the painter Leonora Carrington. But talk about this, because it took a lot of explaining for some of us to really understand what was in Cecilia's head.
Well, as a curator, or at least for me, it's always hard to find titles, because titles of exhibition can be very cheesy, very generic. I'm not particularly good at that, so I'm not saying that I'm better, but what I try to do, I always try to look into other fields. Literature is one of those, where authors and writers are much better with words than often curators. So I often appropriate or steal titles from books. And of course, the title of the Venice Biennale is a big task to find. And as I was doing research for the show, one of the things that I often do to get inspirations and ideas is also to read artists' writings. And so there are incredible visual artists that have also been incredible authors and writers. And Leonora Carrington is a great example of this. I knew I wanted to include her work, and I started reading her incredible novels. She was a very talented writer, and also short stories that might be known to some of you. And then I found this little book, which is called The Milk of Dreams, which is the title of a children's book. She wrote fairy tales and stories for her kids when she moved to Mexico City in the 40s to escape the Second World War. And she originally drew these pictures and stories directly on the wall of her apartment, and then she gathered them in a little notebook that eventually was entitled The Milk of Dreams. And the stories that are told in this book are all stories of transformations and metamorphoses, sort of celebrating a world where people can change, can become hybrid creatures between animals and humans and non-humans. And she did that with such a lightness and levity and joy that those were the themes I was really thinking of as I was conceiving the Biennale. And so it felt like it could be a great way of bringing an artist's voice into the title of the show. And of course, the exhibition was sort of embedded with the atmosphere and, if you like, the soul of surrealism that is one of the threads of the exhibition. So I try to sort of to use this title also to evoke that side. I don't know if the title is successful, so we'll see. But
I think it
people
was
had lots of
very
different ideas and interpretations.
well. I am here to attest that it was very successful, and among the many areas he succeeded, and I think really established a unique brand of this 59th Biennale was around the issue of representation, an unprecedented representation of women and gender nonconforming people. Share with us why you felt this was important and would be a signature of your Biennale.
Well, it's I got to these numbers just because we're starting from there. It was a long process. It's it was clear. I didn't wake up one day and decided that I was gonna make this show 90% women artists. Not at all. I think it's a convergence of reasons and inspirations. I think first of all, as a curator, I've often worked with lots of incredible women artists. I think some of today's most significant artists happen to be women. And then, of course, I'm not naive about it. Of course, there was an intention also to offer and share this incredible platform with amazing women that have been also overlooked and forgotten over the years. So one of the main traits of the exhibition, besides featuring lots of women artists, is that it's a trans-historical show. So it doesn't necessarily focus just on the contemporary, which there is plenty, but does this exercise of looking back at the past, at the history of the Venice Biennale, at the history of art in general, and try to bring in also voices of artists, mostly female artists, that were not part of the big art history as the one that we read in the books. So surrealism is a good example. It's a movement that a lot of people know, of course, for incredible painters and artists like Breton and Miro and Magritte and Dali, but nobody could ever mention female artists, but there were plenty of. And so that was also one of the reasons to bring in a large amount of female voices. And then, of course, there is also the context of the Venice Biennale on one side and of Italy on the other side. The Venice Biennale, this was a 59th edition. And besides the last one that was curated by Ralph Rugov and was actually equally split between men and women, in the previous ones, there was an extraordinary imbalance between genders. And in a way, it's, I wanted not necessarily to correct that, but I wanted to show that you could do hopefully a good show by also kind of reversing that percentage and show the incredible works of female artists. And then finally, while it might not seem necessarily a radical gesture, and it wasn't supposed to be a radical gesture, but it might not seem so radical here. The show takes place in Italy, and I'm Italian, and the context is very, very different from here in the States, and we're still very behind when it comes to equity and to rights. So it's I wanted the show to be very, very meaningful for the Italian people, and it was also much more controversial than what you might have heard in America, which I think in general was fairly embraced. But in Italy, there were still people that could not really connect to it because they would just dismiss the show because it was full of women. And so that was actually, to me, a spark that kind of started discussions and conversations about things that Italians don't want to speak about.
Well, I think there was no doubt, as Komal said in her beautiful introduction, that this was an excellent Biennale, critically acclaimed, rigorous in its conceptualization, expansive in your vision, and really brilliant in the execution. So this notion of equity, of representation, and excellence going hand in hand is something I think you demonstrated quite masterfully in this Biennale. I want to pivot because there were some interesting pairings that you did that was another feature that was out of the ordinary. So talk a little bit about these pairings. I mean, for example, the late Cuban artist Belkis Ayon and Simone Lee and the Arsenale and others.
Yeah.
Where did this idea come from?
Well, I wanted the exhibition to be a dialogue among artists. Very often when you visit large exhibitions like this, like the Venice Biennale, often one room is given to one artist. So it's a kind of a choreography of a lot of voices, but there is little dialogue among them. And, the reasons are disparate. Sometimes it's lack of time, lack of resources. But to me, I really focus on creating a journey through the space that would highlight the dialogues and would show artists that might be familiar to most of us in a new light. And that light came through the conversations between artists that might be at first not similar. And so the room that you mentioned is the entrance of the Arsenale venue, which is one of the two venues of the Biennale. And I wanted to start this room by bringing this incredible artwork by Simone Lee, the artist that also represented the US in the National Pavilion, with this sculpture called Brick House, which was actually produced by us at the Highline back in 2019. And it's this magnificent bronze sculpture. It's a portrait of a Black woman whose torso becomes this form of between a skirt and a form of Western African architecture. And many people remember it on the Highland because it was this incredible vision above 10th Avenue, especially during the month of the pandemic when the city was empty. And it is a monument, but I also wanted to bring it indoor and show how powerful that piece would even be within, the closed space of the first room of the Arsenale. And the sculpture turned out to be much more intimate in a way. To me, it changed completely. And that's why I also wanted to surround it with these incredible works on paper by the artist Belkis Ayon, who was a Cuban artist who actually participated in Venice back in 1993. And she makes these gorgeous, they're called collography. They're kind of prints that are actually almost three-dimensional in their surfaces, depicting this sort of mythical and mythological matriarchal society with these very gorgeous figures that in a way rhyme but with a brick house and with the work of Simone, but they're also completely different. But they do evoke a connection with history and memory and land in a very different way. And so throughout the exhibition, you have these pairings, which sometimes can be not necessarily didactic, like in the other venue of the Biennale in the Central Pavilion. One of the first rooms showed the pairing of Andra Ursuta, who is a young artist from Romania, with Rosemary Trockel, who's a very well-known German artist who makes abstract canvases that are made of wool. And so I try to sort of introduce two themes of the show. One was the idea of metamorphosis that was very well represented by Andra Ursuta's glass sculptures, and then these very abstract paintings by Rosemary Trockel that on one way, they look almost like computer screens. They look very digital, but when you get close to them, you realize they're made of wool. And there is a whole, of course, reflection on the idea that knitting is something that is usually associated with women, but actually they were made with an electronic loom. So the idea of technology comes into play. So I don't know, sometimes it's all in my head. I don't know if it's visible to the outside, but those are the way as a curator, I try to tell a story by putting together different voices.
Yeah, in a really compelling way. You talked a little bit, Cecilia, about the feedback that you received. What surprised you? Did anything when you now reflect, or in the moment when it happened, what surprised you?
Well, sometimes there are pairings or things that I didn't necessarily saw that happened serendipitously in the installation, but actually turned out to be really good questions. I think to me the most surprising or maybe the most gratifying aspect or part was how many young people, especially young women, came to me and were brave enough to stop me in the exhibition space without knowing me, and just came to me and say, congratulations, this show was very influential for me, changed my life. I'm so happy. I feel so welcome and so represented here. And, I wish when I was a young woman, I had the courage to do the same and to go to incredible curators and share my feelings. But that was very, very, very surprising to me.
Well, it was a very tumultuous, difficult period during which you planned the exhibition, and then to really have it unfold and be so successful. But there was really a really powerful paragraph you wrote in one of the wall texts. And I just want to read a bit of it and then have you reflect on it. And you say, the pressure of technology, the heightening of social tensions, the outbreak of the pandemic, and the looming threat of environmental disaster remind us every day that as mortal bodies, we are neither invincible nor self-sufficient, but rather part of a symbiotic web of interdependencies that bind us to each other, to other species, and to the planet as a whole. Talk about that. Why did you, that's an incredibly, almost existential statement of the condition of humankind and our planetary ecosystem. Talk about that.
Yeah, so I think in a way it kind of summarizes many of the preoccupations or themes that the show was trying to raise. And to me, it was, first of all, one need to understand how complicated it was to put together. Also, just conceptually, this exhibition, in that I basically conceived this exhibition the first year of the pandemic, when we really didn't know anything about what the world was going to be. No vaccine yet. It's hard sometimes to remember, but what I try to do in the show, of course, I had my ideas and my sort of inspirations, but I really wanted to listen to the artists and try to convey in this exhibition the many preoccupations, anxieties, and just thoughts that artists had, because I had eventually talked and met so many artists via Zoom, and eventually, the world was kind of in pause mode. Like there was nothing, there was not much to see in their studio. The conversations became, as you say, very much existential. They became almost like a confession, like where we share many things, and we looked at art as a way of staying sane and staying alive. And so one of the main kind of preoccupations that also came to the fore is the realization that, for instance, this idea that technology and science could, make us live for longer and longer, and this sort of scientific and technological optimism, which was very common just right before the pandemic, all of a sudden was turned upside down, and this complete uncertainty in what was going to happen next, and this idea that all of our physical relationship had to happen through the mediation of the screen was a radical shift in the way we kind of relate to each other. And so I think many artists started thinking about these relationships and what connects us not to the other, which of course there is plenty, but also what connects us to the natural world and to the environment and to what surrounds us, and try to approach it, especially in the artwork, not as a way of, as a hierarchical way, but as a way of a more rhizomatic way, a more egalitarian or more collaborative, symbiotic ways of living together, because the pandemic also showed us that we were all subject to this invisible force that nobody could actually fight for the first year, and we shared things that we did not know we were sharing. So I try to really listen to the artists and convey within the sort of themes of the exhibition this sort of uncertainty of the moment we were all living.
And so as we come to the end of our conversation, I'm so grateful to you, Cecilia. I would like you to just give me your thoughts. This series at Stanford is called Artists in the Future, and we're certainly grateful to Komal and to Gaurav for their generosity. But share with us how you believe artists are playing a role and can play a role in helping us think about, shape, imagine the future.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's an excellent question. I think, to me, I look at artists and art as those people that can, make you look at the world around you in a completely different way. It's almost like wearing a pair of glasses that you just had there next to you. And I think art and artists have the power to sort of revisit what our life is made of, and even when it comes to obvious things that we take for granted, and just represent them to us under different lights and offering different entry points. And that's something that I see so much on the High Line, which is of course not an art venue. Most people come to take a beautiful walk in an incredible park that is up in the sky, and you walk through the buildings. But I do see that when they see an artwork, no matter they know who the artist is, no matter they know what the medium is, they do stop and they have an encounter. And that encounter, it can be fulfilling, it can be educational, it can be surprising, it can be upsetting. But that's what art does. It makes you stop and opens up little hints and suggestions for you to look at things. Maybe it's just a plant next to it, or maybe it's just a skyline of New York City in a completely different way. And so I think that's something that is very impalpable and very hard to grasp. And that's why artists can do it so well, because they have really the tools of telling stories in a completely different ways.
Well, Cecilia Alemani, this is why you are such a beloved and amazing curator. I want to thank you for this conversation, and again, thank Komal and Gaurav, and how grateful we are to have another amazing person in Veronica Roberts at the helm. Thank you, Veronica.
I just want to say thank you so much to Darren and Cecilia for that really beautiful and thought-provoking conversation. I learned so much. And although I did not go to the Venice Biennale 3 times the way Komal did, I'm jealous. I also just wanted to, before I jump into some Q&A that we have from the audience, I want to just share that I think there's no way to, I think it's impossible to capture the influence that this show is going to have on the public, on artists, on the field. It's, but I did want to share that after seeing the exhibition, I added an artist who I was unfamiliar with until your show to a group show that will be at the Cantor next year, an artist named Lillian Schwartz, who's alive and amazing pioneer in video and was embedded in Bell Labs. So I just think, there's no way to calculate all the different ways that shows will be changed, that new shows, that your show will give birth to new exhibitions. And Darren talked about Sonia Boyce, an artist whose lives will also be transformed by this experience. So congratulations to that, for that. And we have some questions that I'm hoping both of you might be able and willing to answer. So one question is how, and this is, I think, for either of you or for both of you, how do each of you see the arts landscape changing with regards to art activism and social justice, particularly in the last 3 years since the onset of COVID? How do you see the arts landscape changing with regards to artist activism and social justice?
Well, I would say that there is no doubt that the ecosystem, the very foundations of how we understand art, culture has been transformed during the period of the pandemic, in part because of the existential threat of the pandemic, and in part because of the difficult racial reckoning that occurred globally as a result of the murders in the United States in the summer of 2020. And with this moment comes a tremendous opportunity to imagine a narrative arc, the arc of art history, being expanded to fully include what is excellent and what excellence is and how it is constituted. Because our museums, I believe, today are more excellent because they include various forms of people, backgrounds, experiences that were historically marginalized in the arc of art history, that narrative arc, which unfortunately left out entire categories of excellence. I mean, when you imagine a history of abstraction in the 1950s and 60s, and remember that Alma Thomas was completely left out of that history, that Sam Gilliam was marginal, and only later, that Carmen Herrera had to be 90 years old before her contributions to abstraction were recognized. And that has all happened in recent years. I think those of us who love art are more educated, are more knowledgeable about what constitutes excellence and who was producing it and who is excluded from recognition and why. So I think, Veronica, the question is a very pertinent one for this moment. And fortunately, to have collectors like Komal Shah, curators like Cecilia, Thelma Golden, and many others who are helping to elevate and demonstrate the potential for excellence, for greatness in our museums and in other places and spaces gives me great hope.
Thank you. That was wonderful. There's another question about your inspiration, Cecilia, with this edition of the Biennale with Leonora Carrington, where she created stories that describe a world where the individual is propelled to transform and shape shift, both spiritually and physically. And this person's question is, do you see this as a metaphor for queer and trans artists who are broadening the landscape of what is possible in terms of our collective identity?
I think that's certainly part of what the overall narrative of the show wanted to embrace. And I think while it might be weird to some of us to look so far back to the 1940s in a children's book by a surrealist artist to find inspiration, what I loved about that is the lack of any kind of judgment or hierarchy that these artists embrace. And it was a very free world for whatever it meant. Of course, it meant different things back then, but that openness and joy of living, it's something that I feel like sometimes we miss, or we are lost completely. And so while I think the show talks more than just identity, I think, of course, that's certainly a very important point of the exhibition.
Thank you. This is another question for you, Cecilia. What inspires you most about your vision for the High Line, and what are some of the biggest challenges that you experience being artistic director and curator there?
I think it's the same thing. The challenges they match with with the inspirations, right? Because it is such a unique space. And I just love, the first time I walked the Highland with an artist who might have been on the Highland before or might not have, and just walking them through all the incredible things that might happen in this park and that are completely out of our control is, I think, on one side, completely frightening to the artists because they're used to working in more controlled environment or safer environment. But on the other side is what excites them to show there. And so in a way, to me, it's a little bit of the distinction between working in a museum versus in a public space. In a museum, usually you work for years and years for this culmination, which is the exhibition. And when the exhibition opens, the show is perfect, nothing changes, the paintings are on the wall, the sculptures are under the vitrine, and that's, for the public to enjoy. When you work on the Highland or in a public space, the exhibition really is out of your hands when it opens. Even if you can try and foresee everything that could possibly happen, the most fulfilling part of this exhibition is when the public comes in and starts embracing and loving and touching and do things to the installations that you cannot and do not want to control. So in a way, as an artist, you kind of have to let go, and your artwork doesn't necessarily belong to you anymore. It cannot be protected, it cannot be separated, but it's part of the fabric of the Highline at that point.
Both you and Darren have the privilege of knowing so many contemporary artists and having worked with so many artists and having them influence your life and your outlook towards the world. But I want to just for a moment go back to both of you as students, since I am here at Stanford and thinking about students all the time. And maybe we can start with you, Darren. I would love to have you share, as your perhaps one of the first experiences you had with living artists, contemporary artists, or with arts as a student in your days at UT Austin, and how that, what impact that your student experiences had on you and who you are now.
Well, I would say it was not a visual artist. It was the author, the public intellectual James Baldwin, who first gave me a view into to art and to the power of art. Of course, he had an ongoing dialogue with Buford Delaney, and there was both, because Baldwin was a self-professed, publicly acknowledged, self-acknowledged homosexual, a Black man, a Black queer man, being very unabashed and proud of his identity, and also holding art as a critical part of his identity in a very interdisciplinary way. He saw the porousness of the written word with the visual painting, with sculpture. And he wrote about this with photography with his friend Richard Avedon. And so I was, when I first encountered Baldwin in college, I was completely enamored. I was enmeshed in him and all things Baldwin. And so I would say he was really the first truly creative, intellectual artist I encountered who spoke to me in very unique and profound ways.
And continues to speak to so many people in profound ways. Cecilia, I know your experiences may be different. Can you share any pivotal sort of early experiences with art when you were a student?
Yeah, for sure. I did not study art. I studied philosophy at the university, at the public university in Milan, where I'm from. So I sort of arrived to the art world from a very different sort of background. I, had very kind of traditional studies before. I studied literature and philosophy. But art was my passion, and I would go. When I grew up, when I was growing up, my parents would take me to museums and to cities in Europe, but I always felt it was more like a passion. I recognized the power of art, but I never thought there could be a job for me, because I knew clearly I was not going to be an artist. I never wanted to be an artist. But then I actually remember, in part, is when I was writing my dissertation. I lived in Paris for a little bit, and I was writing about a French topic. I was writing my thesis on Georges Bataille, who was, of course, a very important kind of anti-surrealist or radical surrealist in Paris in the 20s. And he ran this incredible magazine that was called Document, and my thesis was all about that. And the way he approached this literary magazine was so radical and so experimental because of the way he was using art in it and the reproduction of art. And that sort of led me then, I moved to London, and I remember in London, I actually did a very small course at Tate Modern. It was literally, I think, 2 years after it opened. And I met incredible thinkers and curators and art writers, and I sort of understood that my passion that came more from the theory world could actually be applied to a job, to a profession that, of course, has existed for many years, but back then in the early 2000s, it wasn't as popular as it is now. So I sort of decided to then maybe take the easy way, which was to go to school to become a curator. And then I moved to New York, and I went to Bard College, which at that point, the Center for Curatorial Studies was one of the very, very few curatorial schools in the world. So again, to be a curator, you don't necessarily have to come from the art history world, which is, of course, it's super important. But as Darren was saying, I think both on our side as curator and the artists it's an incredibly porous discipline. They're inspired by other disciplines, they take from other disciplines, and it's this sort of symbiotic world that I also try to discuss in Venice.
I am so thrilled that we could bring the two of you together. Both of you, by your actions and the platforms that you have really lent an important voice to equality. And I think that, Cecilia, it was very unexpected what we saw at the Venice Biennale. I have known you for a long time, but there was nothing that could prepare me for the magic that was going to happen and how we really were able to open our minds and eyes. And I think for me, the best part was, and as Veronica mentioned, I visited the Biennale 3 times. But to see young women walking with their heads held high and gushing over how much they loved the show was important. And not just because it was women, but it was so beautifully done and proved the point about how amazing women artists and gender non-conforming artists can be. And we just have to open our eyes and heart and minds to it.
That's beautifully said, Komal. That's a beautiful note to end on. And I just want to thank you both again, and to everyone who's tuning in how much we appreciate you tuning in for this wonderful conversation, and check back for more Artists on the Future. And thank you again, Darren, Cecilia, Komal. Thank you so much for this wonderful conversation.
Thank you for having us. Thank you, Darren.